This is Grape Video 45, Red Vitis Vinifera varieties in Michigan. Oh my, what a topic we're going to have here. Oh, look at that. So many grape varieties, so many. This is the single most important decision that you will make in planting your vineyard, what variety to plant. Think of it. You can choose a great site. You can prepare it well, you can plant the vines well, you can establish a beautiful trellis, you can do everything culturally perfectly, and if you don't have a suitable variety, all will be for naught. So, take the time to look into as much information as you can about the variety or varieties you're going to plant. We're going to cover varieties that we have experience with or think about or we have on trial, etc. in Michigan. There is no intent here to try to cover all the varieties that exist. That would be an impossible task. If you want to see the entire list of grape varieties worldwide, as well as breeding lines and rootstocks, this is the place to go. Unbelievably, there are about 23,000 cultivars, rootstocks, and breeding lines at the Vitis International Variety Catalog website that was established in 1984 at the Geweilerhof Institute for Grapevine Breeding. It's an amazing database, and you can go there and you will find every variety listed, and it'll tell you a few things about them. It'll tell you about the pedigree of the variety. It'll even tell you at times some places where this variety is located in case you're trying to hunt down something that's a little hard to find. So this is the authoritative, comprehensive listing of grape varieties for the entire world. But we're only going to cover a modest number of that 23,000 in our presentations here, and they're the ones with which we have experience in a cool climate viticulture. So this is a biased presentation towards viticultural regions that would be entitled cool climate or cold climate. So let's proceed. By the way, if you want to go to the VIVC website right now, you can just click on the link below. It'll take you right there. First of all, we're going to present a total of 9 videos in the following categories. Under Vinifera, we're going to do red and white, and that is our first presentation here under red. And then we're going to talk about hybrids, as seen here. We'll go on to what we're going to call super hardy varieties, and then native varieties for North America, and lastly, table grapes. So in those categories, we will present 9 videos in total, this being the first one. Okay, there's lots of things we might like to know about a variety, but we've put down a listing of the basic information a grower needs to know about a grape variety. We created this listing so that we could gather the most fundamental information about a grape variety in our variety trial work. Here goes. Hardiness. Will the variety survive in your vineyard? If it won't, game is over. You don't need to know anything else about it. If it is not hardy enough for your location, you don't need to know another thing about that variety. So that's number 1. Number 2, bud break. Will this variety be susceptible to spring freezes in your vineyard? What is the situation in your vineyard? Are you protected against spring freezes with nice sloping ground that escapes Many spring freezes? Okay. If not, you're going to want to look for varieties that have a later bud break than average. And so you're going to try to find that out for the variety you think is so wonderful and you want to plant. When does it break bud? Time of ripening. Can you ripen this variety in your vineyard? There are a lot of varieties that require very long, extended growing seasons to fully ripen the fruit. Many times, in many locations in Michigan, we cannot grow those varieties because we just don't have a long enough growing season. And that may be true for you too. And of course, fruit and wine quality. If you're growing grapes for fresh fruit, you want to know about the fruit quality. But if you're going to grow the grapes to process into wine, that's the ultimate. What kind of wine quality can you get out of this grape that you're thinking of growing? And so you want to look into that as best you can before you put the first vine in the ground. In this video, we're going to first talk about the commercial red vinifera varieties that we grow in Michigan, and we're going to do that in the order of their importance. So the most widely planted we'll talk about first, etc. When we're through talking about commercial varieties in Michigan, we're going to talk about other varieties that are under trial or in small quantities at grower farms, etc., that really aren't commercial, but varieties that we either think we could plant or that we have tried in our variety trials, etc. And we're going to give some words about that. So let's begin. Pinot Noir is one of the classic wine grapes of the world. Its culture dates back to at least the 1st century when it was cultivated by the Romans. It is a grape of passion for its followers. Pinot Noir is suited to cool climates. The famous Burgundy region in France is its center point for success as a table wine. It is also one of the 3 principal varieties used for Champagne in the Champagne region of France. It is a relatively cold tender variety, so it must be grown on protected sites. Its tight clusters make Pinot Noir vulnerable to fruit rots. There have been some cultivars that are less compact, but for the most part, most clones of Pinot Noir are tight clustered. There are many challenges when growing and vinifying Pinot Noir. It is susceptible to spring frost. Many plantings ultimately become infected with leaf roll virus. Vines have often possessed low vigor. When the fruit is left too long on the vine, the thin-skinned berries shrivel, so the resulting wines can have an off-raisin character. Pinot Noir can have outstanding flavor, but it often possesses a light pigmentation in the skins that can be challenging to the winemaker. It can have other problems in the winery too. The pH of the fruit becomes elevated during ripening and subsequent vinification, and that can be a challenge for the stability of the wine. Optimum ripening is said to occur on relatively cool slopes that can allow for a slow, gradual ripening of the grape. It is estimated that worldwide there are as many as 1,000 clones of Pinot Noir, and that has to do with the instability of this variety genetically. There are many natural clones that have occurred over the years, and in recent years there have been many new and improved clones that a grower should look into if he or she is going to plant this variety. Well, despite all the challenges, this is the most widely planted premium red wine grape variety in Michigan, and I think that's a testimony to why people want to grow, vinify, and drink this grape, even though it has the challenges that we have mentioned. So if you're going to vinify this grape, good luck to you. Cabernet Franc is the second most widely planted premium red vinifera variety in Michigan, and we think highly of this variety. It is also grown extensively throughout the world in many countries. Cabernet Franc matures late, though not as late as Cabernet Sauvignon. It is the most hardy of the commonly grown red vinifera grapes in Michigan, and we are glad of that, but it is susceptible to the major grape diseases like black rot, downy mildew, and powdery mildew. It's only moderately susceptible to botrytis black rot because it typically has a somewhat loose cluster, not fully compact, but in some years we can get a fair amount of botrytis rot on this variety, yes indeed. It is vigorous. The vines of Cabernet Franc tend to be very vigorous, produce big vines with big crops, and so it often needs to be thinned severely to obtain the moderate crop levels needed to reliably produce quality fruit and quality wines. When Cabernet Franc is overcropped, it can produce a highly undesirable bell pepper character that many find offensive. Nevertheless, when adequately ripened, it has been successfully used both as a varietal and as a significant component of many of our premium red wines. Merlot. Merlot is the third most popular premium red wine grape in Michigan. And it turns out Merlot is the third most widely planted wine grape in the world. It accounts for not quite 6% of the whole world production of wine grapes. This is a very, very popular grape. In California in the 80s, there were only about 2,000 acres, and over the next 30 years, that 2,000 acres expanded to about 50,000 acres. So it's a very, very popular variety that we're going to talk about here. Merlot originated in the 18th century in the Bordeaux region of France, and Cabernet Franc is one of its parents. I was very surprised to learn that Merlot is the dominant red wine grape in the Bordeaux region. I would have thought Cab Sauvignon, but no, Merlot is the dominant red wine grape in Bordeaux. Well, let's talk about the growing of Merlot here. Just because this is such a very popular variety does not mean that it can be grown just anywhere, because Merlot is, in relative terms, a very cold tender variety, and it will get injured when the temperatures start to dip down to -5 to -10 Fahrenheit, which converts to about -20 to -23 Celsius. So you need a site for growing this variety that is going to escape very low winter temperatures if you're in a cold climate situation. That's the first thing we need to say about it. The next thing is that Merlot really is susceptible to the major grape diseases. It has a lot of problems with the mildews, and it can even have botrytis rot, even though the variety is often not as compact as shown here in the picture. So you have to be very careful when you grow this variety to have a good fungicide spray program for disease control. The nice thing about Merlot is that it ripens kind of mid-season or late mid-season, so it ripens well ahead of Cabernet Franc or Cabernet Sauvignon. So if you can get it through the winter, you can reliably ripen it often. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So be careful. Be careful when you grow Merlot to make sure that you have a site that can be protected through the winter. You may need to use special practices for helling up around or burying canes and so on if you're going to force yourself to grow this in a harsh environment. Cabernet Sauvignon. It has been called, rightfully so, the king of all wine grapes worldwide, and indeed, it is the number one producing wine grape in the world and is responsible for more than 6% of the world's wine production. The king, the king. Well, it originated in the Bordeaux region of France, and it's interesting that Cabernet Sauvignon was a cross between Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc, hence Cabernet Sauvignon. It's a wonderful grape. It produces relatively small clusters with thick skins, and those thick skins contain considerable amounts of the coloration and the rich tannin structure that is known in Cabernet Sauvignon wines. Because there's so much tannin in those skins, these wines may be harsh at first and require aging to soften that tannin structure. It is a grape that's made into its own varietal, but it's also blended with many other varieties, and especially Cabernet Franc and Merlot. Because of the intense tannin structure, Cabernet Sauvignon wines do age well in the bottle for extended periods of time. However, here's the problem. This variety ripens late, very late. That's its weakness. And if this grape is not adequately ripened, the fruit quality can be very poor, very herbaceous, and very unacceptable. So, if you're going to grow this grape, you need to have it located on a site that will have a long growing season and a warm growing season to ripen this fruit well. I think that's why Cabernet Sauvignon is the fourth most popular premium red wine grape variety in Michigan and not number one as it is worldwide, because we just don't have the warm sites often enough to reliably ripen this grape. We should add that this grape does get the major grape diseases, the mildews. It can get botrytis rot, and it does on occasion, but it's not as susceptible as many varieties because of its thick skin and its cluster configuration that is not fully compact. But yes, indeed, there are years when botrytis will attack Cabernet Sauvignon. So be careful if you consider this grape. Just because it's very, very popular, once again, doesn't mean that your site will be suited for it. Make sure that you have a site that will have a long maturation period in the fall. And if you have early freezes on your site in the fall, Cab Sauvignon is not the grape for you. Syrah. The first thing we need to say about this grape is that it has a significant second name, Shiraz, and that originates from its production in Australia. The origins of Syrah are somewhat disputed. It was thought that it may have originated back in the time of the Romans and Persians, but then there was more recent information to suggest that it originated in France, where it is grown in the Rhone Valley region, and that is still the center of its production. It seems that this is a French variety. This variety, as we said, is also extensively grown in Australia, where it is called Shiraz. The acreage in California has been growing and is now around 18,000 acres, so it is very much appreciated and grown in California too. The problem for those of us in climates like Michigan is that Syrah is not fully winter hardy. We had significant winter injury to Syrah vineyards 2 and 3 years ago when we had quite severe cold temperatures, and some of those vineyards just never did recover and we lost them. I've inquired in other cold climate regions, and always I hear the same story. The wine is wonderful. People love Syrah as a wine, but in the vineyard it can be difficult if you are in a cold climate. There has been a virus, an unknown virus associated with Syrah in many vineyards, and I think there's progress being made on getting cleaner, more reliable planting material of this variety, but you need to check on that if you're going to plant this variety at all. Syrah does produce wines with intense color and a rich, full body. It ripens mid-season. If the fruit becomes overripe, it may lose its varietal character, so be careful about that. So Syrah is a possibility, but one that should be considered very carefully. Gamay Noir. I put this variety in this presentation primarily because it has been successfully grown for many years near Traverse City, Michigan, out on the old Mission Peninsula, and it produces a nice wine there. The Gamay Noir grape has at times been called Gamay Beaujolais, but it's my understanding that that name is being retired and used less and less in current years. The grape is used to make a very young, fresh, fruity, floral wine that is consumed young after vinification. The wine really doesn't age well, but it has a marketing niche for very young, fresh, fruity wines made of this grape. And so it bears merit for consideration and planning for that niche. Limburger. Well, before we talk about the grape and the wine, one of the biggest issues with Limburger is its name. People often don't like it. In fact, some people think it sounds like Limburger cheese. And there have been efforts to change the name of this or add synonyms in the United States that are official, but that hasn't been successful to my knowledge. In the Germanic countries, in Europe, Eastern Europe, the predominant name there is Blaufränkisch, but that doesn't have much consumer appeal either. All the Germanic countries in Eastern Europe have their own name for this grape. There are numerous synonyms for the name of this variety, and some production has just gone away from its varietal name entirely and called it something else just to find a name that is more appealing to consumers. So this is likely to be a stigma on this variety for quite a while to come. Let's talk about the grape. It really is a grape that has deep color, moderate tannin structure, and it has often been described as having a black, peppery, spicy character. And it can produce some very nice wines. We don't always reliably ripen this grape well in Michigan because it is a late ripening grape. So you need a site that's going to allow this grape to ripen well into the fall harvest period. You cannot grow this in a short season climate. Other than that, it has some tendency to be susceptible to powdery mildew especially, so be careful about that. But it is worthy of consideration, and we have more and more wines being made of Limburger in Michigan in recent years than in the past. So it will probably grow in acreage and an interest in the years to come, but probably not a large amount of planting of it, but it will grow in importance in Michigan and probably other cool climate areas. Zweigelt. Zweigelt was created in 1922 in Austria by Dr. Fritz Zweigelt, hence its name. It is a very hardy red vinifera and the principal red wine grape in Austria. Zweigelt is said at times to have a late bud break, but we have doubts about that because in our limited experience here, we think it actually has an early bud break. I'm going to show you more about that. Zweigelt produces an excellent full-bodied red wine, and it ripens early. And this is a grape that bears more evaluation in cooler climate viticultural areas. Now I'm going to show you some pictures I took just the other day in a southwest Michigan vineyard, and we'll start with Chardonnay. So on this same day, and these varieties are grown within a short walking distance from each other. Here is the bud break on Chardonnay. Shoots as much as 4 or maybe even 5 inches long. That's the earliest bud breaking variety of the 6 or so varieties I'm going to show you. But not far behind it is Cabernet Franc, shown here. And here's Zweigelt. So Zweigelt comes out for us fairly early as an early bud breaking variety, and you'll want to check on the time of bud break of Zweigelt and confirm it from other sources, but we think it's early bud breaking, not late bud breaking. To complete the story, here is Gruner Veltliner, another Austrian variety, and it comes out a little later than the first 3 I mentioned. And then Merlot is just breaking bud, as you can see, and the last variety, Cabernet Sauvignon, is barely having bud swell. So Merlot and Cab Sauv are late bud breaking, and we think that Zweigelt is more of an early bud breaking variety, which could make an important difference to you depending upon the type of site you might consider planting this grape on. So we're going to move on to other varieties. This is Zweigelt. Barbera. As we start the rest of this series, we should say that all the varieties that we've talked about up till now are at least in some level of commercial production in Michigan. But starting now with Barbera, we're going to talk about varieties that are not in commercial production in Michigan. Most of them we have very limited experience with, and they're limited to variety trials at our research stations or growers that just have a few vines and have tried to grow them on their own. So as we go forward, we fully admit that we have limited experience and knowledge of these varieties in our Michigan climate, and we will speak to the limitations of these varieties as we proceed. So let's move on with Barbera. Barbera has been grown since the 13th century, and it is most widely known or most famously known from the Piedmont region of Italy. It is the number 3 red grape in Italy, widely grown, but it's also grown around the world. It was taken to California a long time ago. It's in Argentina, Australia, and many other places. So this is not a new grape by any means. It's a very vigorous growing variety and produces large vines with abundant crops. Here is such a crop that we had on our variety trial in 2012, and you can see how many grapes we had, and we didn't thin these grapes. And this is a typical problem with Barbera for many growers because it is so very fruitful and produces such large clusters in abundance that the tendency is to overcrop the vine. So We were guilty of that on some vines in 2012. Well, this past year in 2016, we at least thinned the crop down to something that we thought would be manageable. We should say that as you look at these Barbera clusters, they do look rather reddish. They're not very mature. This is early yet. It's 1st of September, but this is a late ripening variety, so it needs a site that can ripen the grape well into the fall, and it needs to be thinned to have any chance to make it succeed. Here we are a little later in the season in 2016, and the fruit is ripening. We were able to get this fruit to 21 bricks by the 10th of October this past year. The limitation of Barbera for us may be its very high acidity, because it really produces a lot of acid, and it is a grape that has a lot of color, a lot of tannins, a lot of acid in the grape. And when we harvested this on the 10th of October this past year, it still had a 1.37 grams per 100 mil acidity, titratable acidity. So this is one of the characteristics of this variety. The reason that we include this in the presentation here is because we've been so impressed with its survival through our winters. We had two very bad winters in the winters of 14 and 15, where the minimum temperature went down to minus 12 Fahrenheit, that's minus 24 Celsius, and these vines survived 100%. We have not lost a single vine. We did have bud mortality in those years and lost about 80% of the buds for the year, but the vines through all of those harsh winters have survived and come back to produce decent crops. So we throw this out to you as a possibility with those limitations of high acidity, some bud mortality in very bad years, but the vine survives and grows, and it does produce some large, magnificent looking clusters. Dolcetto. It is another Italian red from the Piedmont region in northwestern Italy. It has been grown for centuries, and it has survived well in our variety trial in southwest Michigan. It has survived 2 winters of minus 12 Fahrenheit or minus 24 Celsius, and we still have all 24 vines in this trial alive and well. The variety is characterized as having intense color, but light tannins and relatively low acidity, so it makes a light, fruity wine that can be consumed early in its life. The problem we have had with Dolcetto is that it seems to deteriorate during the ripening process. We have this deterioration occurring on the clusters. It may be just the way we're growing the grape or our management, but there seems to be a narrow window of harvesting this grape when it's ripe to adequately process it. So you'll want to check with other sources about this grape if you would plan to grow it, but we can assure you that it is relatively hardy and comes through really tough winters reasonably well, and for that reason it may deserve further consideration. Dornfelder. Dornfelder was created in 1955 at the Institute for Grape Breeding at Weinsberg, Germany, and it has become the second most popular red wine grape in Germany. It is also grown in many areas around the world in modest amounts, And I put it in this listing because we have some growers with small plantings of this in Michigan, and it seems that the results so far have been encouraging. So, it is a grape that has thick skins, resistance to rot, it has nice deep color, good acidity, and in general warrants consideration for future plantings. Lagron. Lagron is another of the northern Italian reds, and this variety originated in the Trentino region and has a history going back to the 16th century. Lagron has been in our variety trial in southwest Michigan for the past decade, and it has had a very interesting experience. The vines generally have been hardy. In the 10 years we've been growing it, we've lost 1 out of 24 vines, and that has been after 2 winters when it went down to minus 12 Fahrenheit or minus 24 Celsius. So the vine itself is pretty hardy. Unfortunately, in our experience, the buds are not as hardy. We have had years when the vines survived well, but virtually all of the count nodes or fruiting buds have been killed during those cold winters, but the vine has come back well. Even this past winter, when the winter low was 5 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 15 degrees Celsius, we had in the spring only about a 60% node survival of the fruiting buds. Nevertheless, that was quite adequate to produce the crop that you see here. And it went on to ripen to 21 degrees Brix on the 10th of October with nice acids and a nice pH. So it can produce very nice grapes and wine for us in many years in southwest Michigan, so it is worthy of consideration. The fruit is said to be highly tannic and may require an extended storage period of the wine to allow it to soften before it's marketable. This variety is grown to some extent in Australia and modest amounts in California and Oregon and New York and other places. So if you have a site that will not be totally harsh in the wintertime with low temperatures, this is a variety that may be worthy of consideration for you. Mourvedre. Okay, there you have my best effort at the Spanish pronunciation of what I'll now call Mourvedre. This is a Spanish grape from Spain, where there has been more than 250,000 acres of it grown. And it's also grown in southern France, I understand. And we grew Mourvedre in our variety trial at the MSU Southwest Michigan Research and Extension Center for 10 years, from about 1998 through 2007. And unfortunately, after that 10-year period, only 42% of the vines were still alive, so it wasn't very winter hardy in our trials. Mourvedre needs a long, hot growing season in order to properly ripen. So this grape does really not appear to be a good candidate for a cool climate area like Michigan because of its lack of hardiness and because it needs such a long, hot growing season in order to ripen properly. Nebbiolo. Nebbiolo has its origins in the Piedmont region in northern Italy. And the name Nebbiolo refers to fog, which apparently occurs frequently at the time this grape is harvested. This variety produces a light-colored wine with intense tannin structure And because of that tannin structure, it must be aged for a long time. We had this variety at the MSU Southwest Michigan Research and Extension Center, and a grower up in Michigan on Leelanau Peninsula also had this variety, and it did not perform well in either location, neither in terms of vine survival or ripening of the fruit. So it really is a variety that is not suited well for our Michigan climate and perhaps not for other cool climate viticultural regions. Petite Sirah. Petite Sirah is a grape that was hybridized by a Frenchman named Durif in the 1860s, so it's not a new grape by any means. And in many parts of the world, it is known by the name Durif, not Petite Sirah. But in the United States, the TTB recognizes both of these names as the variety. This grape has a very, very special place in winemaking because of its acidity. It produces very high acid levels, very tannic acid levels, and for that reason, it has been grown widely at times. At one time, the most widely planted red grape in California, for example, and the wines have a very, very long shelf life, can exist in the bottle well for long, long periods. So it has enjoyed favor for that reason. Another great attribute of this is it's very, very resistant to downy mildew disease. We have had Petite Sirah in our variety trial in southwest Michigan for a little more than a decade, and it has survived well as a vine. It has survived winters of minus 12 Fahrenheit, or that is minus 24 Celsius, and gone on to be productive. Sometimes during the winter, though, the buds are not as hardy as the whole vine. For example, during a very mild winter this past winter, we only had about a 35% bud break on this variety, but it went on to produce a decent crop, as you can see in this picture. I'm not aware of any commercial production of Petite Sirah in Michigan, and so I can't really recommend it. You'll have to give it a try on your own, but you would be interested in this grape probably if you were wanting to produce a red wine with a high tannic structure that is going to need a fair amount of aging to soften, but will have a very long shelf life, and it could add to the complexity of your blended wines. Even though it's used at times as a varietal, it is probably not meant to be a varietal in cooler climate viticulture for sure. Petit Verdot. Petit Verdot is associated most classically with the Bordeaux region in France, where its culture goes back at least to the 18th century. Petit Verdot has a major defect for cool climate viticulture in that it ripens very, very late, and it is so difficult in a cool climate to ripen this grape. The interest in this grape is associated with its deep color, rich tannins, and extended flavor that can add to the complexity of blended red wines. So it is used in Bordeaux for a minor component of 1, 2, 3, 5% of a blend, but it is not used as a varietal standalone in a cool climate like Bordeaux. It is used as a varietal in warmer climates in Australia and so on, But this is not a grape to be utilized in cool climate viticulture as a general rule. Pinot Meunier. Pinot Meunier has a rich history in the Champagne region of France, where it has been said that at times it is the predominant grape being grown there for Champagne production, because it adds a richness to the Champagne that neither Pinot Noir nor Chardonnay do as well. But it is not a grape to be grown for a still wine, generally speaking. So we have had plantings in Michigan, 4 of them, in quite varied locations, and it has survived and grown decent crops for sparkling wine production. There are a couple of positive attributes of Pinot Meunier that make it attractive in cool climate viticulture. For one, it buds out later than a lot of varieties in the spring, so it tends to escape spring freeze episodes. And it ripens early relative to its use for sparkling wine production, so it is a more reliable producer for those 2 reasons. You might want to consider it if you're going to do sparkling wine production. Tempranillo. Tempranillo has been grown in Spain for centuries, and the name Tempranillo is related to the earliness of ripening of this grape, because temprano, if I say it halfway correct, is Spanish for early, and this grape ripens much earlier than a lot of red grapes. So it reliably ripens, and it grows now worldwide in numerous locations. It actually doesn't favor hot climates. It doesn't do well in terms of its varietal character in a totally hot climate, but it does do well when there is a gradual ripening in a relatively cool climate. And so this is a fit for some cool climate viticultural regions. We have had this in Michigan in a couple of locations for a few years with encouraging results. Here you can see how early the Tempranillo is looking ripe or getting ripe on the 1st of September this past year. That's wonderful. Tempranillo vines in our Southwest Michigan variety trial over the past decade have fared well. We have had no vine loss at all, so we find it relatively winter hardy, at least for the long-term survival of the vines. We do have some problems on occasion with bud mortality and steady cropping in very difficult years, but even after 2 winters of minus 12 Fahrenheit or minus 24 Celsius, all the vines in our trial survived and went on to revive and grow in future years to produce crops like this. So it is worthy of consideration in cool climate viticulture, and you may want to give it a try. Teraldigo. This is a grape that is ancient. It goes back apparently to at least the 15th century, and its roots are in the northern Italian region called Trentino, and that's the center of its production. Well, at least it was. Now there's such interest in this grape, it's being grown in many places worldwide. And it's a grape that's worthy of consideration for us. We've had it in our trials in Southwest Michigan for the past 10 years, and we've had 96% survival of the vines, and we've been able to ripen the fruit in most years quite well. It has failed us after some really severe winters in terms of bud mortality, but the vines have survived and come back to be productive. Here we have it on 9/1 or September 1, 2016, looking pretty decent. Here's another picture from years ago on the 27th of September, and we generally ripen this mid-season, late September, early October, something like that. So this is a variety that, although it's ancient, is just being discovered new in many viticultural regions and being tried. So it is worthy of consideration. You might want to look into this a bit more and see if this is a variety that is worthy of planting in your vineyard. Well, that concludes our presentation on the red vinifera varieties that we have had some experience with or exposure to in Michigan. We hope this information is useful to you. We will have 6 more videos on varieties as we discussed at the beginning. And then we're going to go on about vineyard establishment and talk about how you prepare a site for planting, how you actually plant the vines, and how you take care of them in their early years. So all of that to come. But for now, we'll say thank you for your attention again. And as always, happy grape growing.